I did Job this morning, and I really wanted to follow up with Habakkuk. So after this, I promise I'm going to get out of the Old Testament for a little bit. But I really love a lot of Old Testament writings because I find that things are eternal. You know, some things never change. Some things do, some things never do. Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. And there's a lot of truth to that. You know, and some things don't change. But Habakkuk is a different guy. He's 3 chapters is all. Short read it in 10 minutes. But he was a neat guy in history, you know. He was kind of a contemporary of really Isaiah, Ezekiel. He's with those guys. It was captivity time almost right before that. It was a hard time, right? Israel had been carried off. Judah was kind of going to get carried off. The Babylonians were knocking at the door. The Egyptians had deserted. The Egyptians were hiding out in Egypt because Nebuchadnezzar was getting stronger, and it was getting kind of perilous. And they thought, well, the end is near, and it was. You know, Babylonians were knocking on the door. The Chaldeans, Habakkuk calls them Chaldeans. It's the same groups of folks. But Habakkuk's different because Habakkuk is a guy, unlike most prophets, God just spoke to them and they just said what God said. But Habakkuk is a guy that asks God questions. And he asked 2 questions, and the reason I like to follow up Job with Habakkuk is because he asked 2 questions that are eternal with God, that we ask. And it's kind of like with Job. When you look at Job, you think, well, you know, a lot of this stuff still goes on, and Habakkuk's the same way. But the first question that Habakkuk asks is basically, you know, how long will it be before you help me? You know, it's one of those things. He knew the Babylonians were coming. He saw the destruction was at hand. And he cried out to God and he said, how long? You know, how long is it going to be before you answer us and before you help us? You know, isn't that really kind of an eternal question? You know, even today, people say, well, how long will it be before the Lord comes again? How long is he going to put up with this, you know? When's that going to happen? How long will he put up with all the evil in the world and the bad things in the world? And you know, when will that end? And people still want to know that. And Habakkuk saw Babylon. He saw, you know, it's like I said, it's the end of his time. Nebuchadnezzar's beginning to get power. His father dies. He goes back to Babylon because his father dies. They crown him king. Nebuchadnezzar is going to take all this over eventually. And Habakkuk sees this imminently, sees this coming, and he sees that God isn't doing anything about it. And, you know, we know that they had fallen into all these bad things and all these sins, and God was going to punish them. But Habakkuk is like, okay, you know, you look on this wickedness, destruction and violence are before me, strife exists, contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored and justice is never upheld. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. And you know, Habakkuk asks this question, and both times that Habakkuk asks a question, God's really on it. You know, God answers him. And in the first question, when he says that, God immediately comes back with this discourse. And he says, listen to me, Habakkuk. Babylon's coming. And I'm going to use them to punish you, and you're not going to stop them. Babylon's going to come. They're going to wipe you out. They're so mighty. They're so powerful. You're not going to stop them. I'm not going to step in. You know, you've got to get through this before anything else is going to happen. This is coming, and you can't do anything about it. And so it's this really discourse, and God not only tells Habakkuk this, but he says they're so strong and they're so mighty. And then he even goes on at the end of 1 and he says that their God, basically their God is their power. That they're that powerful. Their horses and their men and their riders are just going to come down on you. And so then Habakkuk, he he's distressed over this because it's not one of those cases where God says, listen, I'm going to step in, I'm going to help you, it's all going to be all right. God's saying, it's going to happen, and you can't do a thing about it. It's going to happen. They're going to come in. They're strong. They're tough. They're mighty. You can't beat them. And it's one of those things where Habakkuk is kind of in a state. So you get down to about verse 11. It says, then they fly along like the wind and pass on, but they will be held guilty, God says. But then he said, those whose strength is their God. You know, they were such a powerful nation. They had absorbed the Assyrians. They were such a powerful nation that nobody could stop them. But of course, the Medes are going to come, and the Medes are going to conquer them, but that's not now. And so then Habakkuk asks another question to God in verse 12. Habakkuk says, your eyes are too pure to prove evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. Why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? Will they therefore empty their net and continually slay nations without sparing? Now, kind of cut some verses out of that. But the other question then, since Babylon's coming, and I'm not going to stop them, they're going to come, they're going to take you, they're going to absorb you, which is exactly what they're going to do. And then Habakkuk says, why are you not going to punish them? Why are you not going to do something to those people who are so evil, who are so bad, who are going to do this to Israel and Judah? Why won't you punish them? You know, where are they going to get their punishment? When's this going to happen? Why do you spare them? Habakkuk says. Why do you spare them? And the interesting thing then is Habakkuk's response, because so Habakkuk poses this question to God, right? And then Habakkuk, if you look at the beginning of verse 2, Habakkuk goes up on this station, on this like guard station. He says, I will stand at my guard post and station myself on the watchtower, which is this big tower on top of the wall. So Habakkuk asks God this question, and then he goes up to this watchtower, and he waits for God to answer him. You know, that's why I say Habakkuk's a different guy. You know, most prophets, that's not how this worked. God came to them, God told them to say something, the prophet said something. They didn't ask questions. But Habakkuk, he's asked this question. He's up on this watchtower and he's waiting. I don't know how long he waits, but he's on this watchtower and he's waiting on God. He's waiting on God to answer him. He says, I will keep watch to see what he will say to me and how I may reply when I'm reprimanded. Habakkuk is ready to discourse with God. He wants God to answer him, and then he wants to say something back to God. He wants to discourse. He wants to be able to argue God, to plead with God, to make his case with God. It's really interesting when you look at this prophet. He's such an interesting little blip in the Bible. But he wants to argue with God. He wants to know how I can reply when God says something back to me. He wants to know what he can say. You know, and that's how come I wanted to follow Job up with Habakkuk, because God speaks to Job, right? I mean, if you take time now to read Job for like 4 chapters, starting in like 38, 37, God's responding back to Job, and God gives Job this huge discourse, right? Where were you when I created the earth? And, you know, do you understand how animals reproduce? I mean, really read the whole thing. It's really fascinating, all the stuff that God goes into. It says, you don't understand any of this. And at the end of that discourse with God, Job is kind of speechless. Job, you know, if you looked at that this morning, Job just kind of backs up and says, you're right. I give up. I'm not smart enough. I repent. You know, I can't argue with it. But here Habakkuk, he wants to respond to God about this. And so God, he starts into this, and he says, and it's another command from God, because if you look at 2, he says, the Lord answered me and said, write down the vision and inscribe it clearly on tablets so that one who reads it may run. You know, that's kind of a fascinating statement, isn't it? You know, write this down so the person that reads it may run. You know, that's one of those cases. It's almost like what Jesus says when he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, Matthew, when he says, pray it's not on the Sabbath, pray that you're not pregnant, pray it's not in winter. Because when you see these signs, you need to get out of town. You need to leave. And so he tells Habakkuk, he says, write this stuff down and put it down, inscribe it, so when people see this, they can run. In other words, I'm not going to save you from these people right now. There's no salvation coming here. I'm not going to do it. You need to get out of town. And you know, when Babylon sieged Jerusalem, it was so bad, they starved them to death. They were selling the dung of birds. They were eating each other's babies. It was beyond anything we can possibly imagine. They starved them to death. And Habakkuk told them, God told them, he says, when you see this coming, run, because this is not going to end well for you. But then God follows it up, and it's kind of interesting because then God follows it up with these woes. And we really don't know if he's talking about Israel or he's talking about Babylon. And I guess you could take it either way. But there's these woes. And God, in qualifying what God's saying here, then God gets down to the bottom two after he says, run, this stuff's coming, you're not going to escape it. And Habakkuk's asked these questions. When are you going to do it? Why do you allow it? When are you going to help? Why do you allow it? And then God, when he gets down to the end of 2, God says, I'm not going to allow it. There's going to be a punishment, because woe to the people who do these things. And by that, he's saying, I'm not going to let this go unpunished. This isn't the end of the story. This isn't the end of what's going to happen. But it's going to get really bad before it gets better. And so he comes down to these woes, and he says, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed, and founds a town with violence. Woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom, even to make them drunk, so as to look on their nakedness. Woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise, and that is your teacher. Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all inside it. So basically, God puts down these woes, and you could take this to be Israel. You could take this to be Babylon, the Chaldeans. But God basically throws down these woes, and he says, if you do these things, then make no mistake, you're going to pay a price. Make no mistake, things are not going to go your way. Make no mistake, I'm going to mete out punishment for you. And so at the end of 2, after Habakkuk asks these 2 questions, and God kind of gives these answers, and then he goes into these woes, and then Habakkuk bursts into song in 3. You know, and so a lot of people think Habakkuk might have been a Levi, because Levites tended to sing to God. So 3 is a song. So in 3, so you get through 1, you get through 2, and then when he gets to the bottom of 2, Habakkuk bursts into song. You know, 3 is a song. Chapter 3 is a song, and it's Habakkuk saying, you know, how wonderful is God, how great is God. But he is also understanding that this punishment, this impending doom is coming. But yet Habakkuk's come to the conclusion that God is going to punish Israel, but that he will redeem Israel, and that it's going to be all right in the end, just as Job figures out it's going to be all right in the end. Habakkuk sees it's going to be all right in the end. And so Habakkuk bursts into this song. And at the end of chapter 3, because this is a song in the Hebrew, chapter 3, and he says, I heard and my inward parts trembled. At the sound my lips quivered. Decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble, because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. You know, that's an acceptance of God's will. You know, at the end of this book, Habakkuk says, I accept it. And I think that's just an amazing statement, isn't it? I mean, Habakkuk asks these real pointed questions. Why don't you punish him? How long is it going to be? And then when God comes back with this response, this is going to happen. And then Habakkuk says, I must wait quietly for the day of distress for the people to arise who will invade us. Habakkuk understands God's will. He understands this is going to happen. And yet, because it's God, Habakkuk decides to wait quietly while they invade. Because Habakkuk understands that nothing is going to sway this. Nothing is going to change it because God has set it in motion. And so Habakkuk accepts it. And he rejoices in that acceptance, that it's going to happen. And then he says, though the fig tree should not blossom, and there is no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he has made my feet like hinds' feet, and makes me walk in my high places. Because Habakkuk understood that even in the darkest time, God is the light. You know, I like to finish this. I would have liked to have done all this morning because I think this fits so well with Job. You know, if you look throughout history, Christians have been crucified, they've been sawed in two, they've been boiled in oil, they've been skinned alive, they've been killed with swords and guns and bullets and bombs. Christians have died by the millions, maybe the billions, I don't know, a lot. And you know, they all did it because they knew in the end God was going to make this right. And isn't that our faith? It's that in the end, regardless of what happens to us in this earth, regardless of what happens to us in this life, regardless, a Christian's faith, a godly person's faith, is that in the end, God's going to make all this right. And I think sometimes you got to have the faith to see that. The faith of Habakkuk, the faith of Job, the faith to accept and yet to know that God will make it right in the end. You know, Jesus was in the garden. Jesus prayed in the garden, Lord, let this cup pass from me. Jesus knew the only way to do the will of God was for him to die on a cross. He knew what he had to do. He knew what was going to happen, and he accepted it because he had the faith, he had the ability to see that in the end, God was going to make everything right. And you know, I think for us, that's our comfort. That's our peace. I can't say everything's ever going to be all right in this world. I don't think the world's ever going to change for the better sometimes, and maybe it's just going to get worse. I don't know. But my faith is that in the end, God has it. And regardless of how it works out for me, in the end, God has it. And I think that's the faith that we need to have. That's the faith of Job, and it's certainly the faith of Habakkuk. He accepted the tragedy that was going to happen in his life, and he rejoiced in it because he knew God in the end would make this work out for good. If we can help you in any way, won't you let it be known while we stand.